Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. And I'm Clive Baldwin. I'm Director of the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in Narrative. And tonight is the 7th Annual Memorial John Mackendy Lecture on Narrative under the auspices of CERN. John Mackendy, who's Associate Professor of Sociology here, and one of the leading figures in promoting narrative, and a leading figure in the CERN, the Centre's coordinating team. We hope that the work of CERN and these lectures are true to his spirit in narrative, and will inspire others as he inspired his colleagues and his students. I'd like to thank Geoffrey Carlton for the publicity work, for UMB Bookstore for providing a bookstall, and there'll be coffee and books available after the talk tonight. And I'd like to thank Lauren Eagle particularly for all the hard work in organising this lecture, Hilde's itinerary, the various meals, the various meetings she's been to. This wouldn't have happened without her. So thank you very much, Lauren, whoever you are. Just a reminder that we'd like you to turn off your cell phones, if you don't mind. And I'd like to call upon Sue Mackenzie Moore to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
It is my absolute delight to introduce Dr. Hilde Lindemann this evening. She is, to be blunt, no slouch. Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University, a Fulbright Scholar and a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, a Fellow of the Hastings Center, and a past President of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. She is also former editor of Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. And there were other details I could have brought in, but my daughter, when I was going over these a couple of nights ago, said to me, "Mom, they're here to hear Hilde." So I won't tell you everything else she's been up to. Dr. Lindemann has written extensively on narrative approaches to bioethics, feminist ethics, the ethics of families, and the social construction of persons and their identities. Her publishing record is exceptional. Dr. Lindemann's 2001 book, Damaged Identities, Narrative Repair, for example, was a groundbreaking text in its articulation of counterstories and their potential to mend individual and group identities in response to the harm done by oppressive master narratives. Her theorizing of these efforts to refuse and contest damaging master narratives has significantly informed my analyses in 2 research projects, and has also been a central inspiration for the recent book that Michel Lafrance and I have collaborated on. Dr. Lindemann is my favorite kind of philosopher, a philosopher whose work refuses to remain in the stratosphere. She grounds her theoretical analyses in embodied experiences and case studies in which socio-political contexts are highlighted and critically considered. Dr. Lindemann searches out lessons to be learned in relation to our use of stories to do moral work, particularly in healthcare. And she establishes these lessons by calling up specific cases to assist us in considering how stories can be used by professionals to interact with individuals and their families, and yet how stories can easily go wrong. Her writing thus highlights the importance of cultivating narrative competence as well as means to do so. For, as she asserts, if we are to use stories as guides to action, we have to be sure we get them right. Dr. Lindemann's scholarship continues to shape current narrative thought. Most recently, she has authored Holding and Letting Go, The Social Practice of Personal Identities, which was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. Dr. Lindemann's lecture this evening will highlight narrative strategies that people in dominant social positions use to counter a counterstory and keep an oppressive social order in place. Given our colleague John McIntyre's commitment to employ narrative analysis in order to better understand human experience and to enhance our efforts to engage morally with others, Dr. Hilde Lindemann is an ideal speaker for this annual lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hilde Lindemann to the podium.
Sue, I think I want a laminated copy of that introduction to put on my tombstone. It was lovely. I can't thank you all enough. It's such a pleasure to look out in this audience and see all these new friends that I've made this weekend here. You are a hospitable people and a kind people, and also you're a lot of fun. So I've had the time of my life, and I can't thank you enough for inviting me. A caveat about my talk. I wrote it for you all. But some of the examples are perforce examples that are better seen in the United States than in Canada. That is because I like to know what I'm talking about. And I don't altogether understand how everything is working in Canada. Well, maybe none of you do either, but some of you do. So I tried to not speak for other people, but restrict my remarks to the things that I knew something about. So, yes, let me explain about Counterstory. As I've developed that concept, a counterstory is a story that's told for the purposes of resisting a socially shared narrative that's used to justify the oppression of a social group. The socially shared story enters the tissue of stories that constitute the group's identity, and that in that way they damage the identity and so constrict group members' access to the goods that are on offer in that society. The counterstory sets out to uproot some part of the oppressive story and replace it with a more accurate one. And in this way, it can sometimes repair the damage that's been done to the identity. Now, whether it's going to succeed is altogether a question of uptake. Enough people in the dominant group are going to have to accept the new story and treat the members of the group accordingly. I developed the notion in this book, which I fondly refer to as Damn ID. In this talk, I'm going to explore some of the difficulties that arise in getting a counterstory to succeed. I'm going to focus in particular on 6 narrative strategies that people in dominant social positions use to counter a counterstory and thereby keep an oppressive social order in place. But first I'm going to have to say a little bit more about how personal identities work. Let's see. Okay. What I've called the social practice of personal identities is a moral practice that we engage in constantly. But it hasn't received much recognition as a moral practice. It's the practice of initiating human beings into personhood and then holding them there. I argue that personhood consists of 4 elements. A human being has sufficient mental activity to constitute a personality. Aspects of that personality are expressed bodily. Other people recognize it as the expression of a personality, and they respond to what they see. Recognition and response are often a matter of understanding who someone is and then interacting with them on that basis. These understandings, both the self-conception that we express and the recognition that's other people's sense of who we are, consist of a web of stories depicting our most important acts, experiences, characteristics, roles, relationships, and commitments. Some of the stories are personal. I, for instance, grew up in a German-speaking household. Others are the widely circulated stories that we use to make sense of the social groups to which we belong. White, middle-class women, university professors, mothers, and so on. I'm all of the above. And that narrative tissue constitutes our personal identities, which play a crucial role in the practice of personhood. Our personal identities fuel the practice because they indicate who we are with respect to other persons, and in that way they guide not only how we're supposed to treat those others, but also how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. As the practice of personhood is governed by rules that are both socially and morally normative, my description of how we engage in that practice aims to capture something important about how morality functions. We're initiated into personhood through interactions with other persons, and we both develop and maintain personal identities through interactions with others who hold us in our identities, as we hold them in theirs. This holding can be done well or badly. Done well, it supports an individual in the creation and maintenance of a personal identity that allows her to flourish personally and in her interactions with others. Done badly, we hold people in invidious, destructive narratives. In some cases, the damaging narratives identify the social group to which someone belongs as socially and morally inferior, and in that way, the stories uphold abusive power relations between us and them. In other cases, the stories that purport to represent the individual's acts or experiences or other important personal characteristics are flat out false, or they get the proportions wrong. In this talk, though, I'm going to set the flawed depictions of individuals to one side and focus on the stories that damage the identities of the social groups to which the individuals belong. Okay. So, for convenience, let's call the socially shared stories that everybody knows the master narratives of the society. Many folk tales qualify as master narratives. Think of Snow White or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And so do nursery rhymes such as Humpty Dumpty, Jack Be Nimble. Children's books such as Anne of Green Gables and the Shakespearean plays of Hamlet and Macbeth and King Lear count too. And so do the biblical tales of Adam and Eve, Samson and Delilah, and the prodigal son. Now, master narratives are crucial for any social interaction. We have to have them because they depict how we're supposed to behave in specific settings. The school narrative tells you that you should sit in the students' desks and raise your hand for permission to speak, but that the teacher may speak and move around freely. The restaurant narrative tells you that when you finish your meal, you aren't supposed to wash up the dishes, but you are supposed not to leave without paying. Master narratives like those guide us through life, and they're often reasonably benign. But there are some whose dictates serve to reinforce unjust distributions of social power by pretending to justify them. And they do that by depicting certain groups of people, them I was just talking about, as inferior to some us. Jews are money-loving self-promoters. Brown-skinned people are dirty and dangerous. Women are stupid sluts. And so on. And the trouble is, when a group of people is stereotyped in that way, the people doing the stereotyping find it normal and natural to treat the members of the group accordingly. And that puts restrictions on how the group members can act. In the United States, for instance, if you are a man with brown skin, the likelihood that you will be killed by a police officer is 3 times greater than if you're white. If you're a young black man, African American, the odds go up to 21 times greater than if you're a young white man. If you're a woman, The chances are 1 in 4 that you'll be raped during your lifetime. And in both sorts of cases, the stories that masquerade as an explanation for why you deserve that sort of treatment are so powerful that even when we know the stories are false, they still retain some of their hold over us. Now, where does their power come from? What is it about damaging master narratives that makes them so much like dragons devouring everything in their path? First of all, they're organic ensembles of stories that grow and change. Secondly, they constitute a worldview. Third, they're epistemically rigged. I'll explain that in a minute. And fourth, because of those 3 features, they're very good at assimilating opposition. So, let's take the features in order. As is perhaps apparent by now, talk of a master narrative is really just a manner of speaking, because the term doesn't designate a single story with a specific plot and a fixed cast of characters. Instead, these are ensembles of repeated themes that take on a life of their own. Fragments of history, biography, films, fables, jokes, and other narrative forms ring changes on them, as do proverbs, music, advertising slogans, and other cultural artifacts. Master narratives are as capacious, as cluttered, as untidy as a Victorian attic. But unlike the attic, they grow or shrink over time. An altered political economy or other social change can push a master narrative in a new direction. What moves it along are additional images, stories, songs, and slogans. Take the story of Cinderella, whose only hope of a good life is for a powerful man to recognize sexual appeal, marry her, and carry her off to his castle. This got an update in 1990 in the movie Pretty Woman. Remember that movie? Which highlights woman's identity as a slut. Julia Roberts is a sex worker. But her sexual appeal is strong enough to persuade the rich and handsome Richard Gere to marry her anyway. Why? Because she demonstrates that she's just as good at serving others without complaint in her own way as her original was in looking after her stepmother and stepsisters, which connects her to all the other stories you know about women whose sluttishness can be forgiven them as long as they know their place, subservient to men. Master narratives take on a fresh vigor with each new accretion, but they are also strengthened by their ties to other master narratives. The master narratives depicting brown-skinned people as dirty purport to justify giving them the dirty work. Somebody's got to collect the trash and mop the floors, and it's fitting that brown men are the ones to do it. As for brown women, well, since they're sluts and servants, but also fit only for dirty work, their job is to serve white people by cleaning their toilets or cleaning up their children's bottoms or whatever kind of child care needs doing. So by interlocking in these ways, master narratives reinforce one another, because they can incorporate an enormous diversity of even the humblest items in the cultural store, and because they can link themselves to any number of other master narratives that do the same thing, these master narratives infiltrate every corner of society. Precisely because master narratives are so widely known, the master narratives of the society allow its members to understand who they are with respect to that society, as well as how the world works. They create a picture of the world that's both comprehensive and reasonably unified, because the narratives that constitute them are not only far-reaching but mutually reinforcing. A theme, say that women are to serve men, plays itself out not only in the Cinderella and domestic worker narratives, but in the master narrative of modern science, which characterizes nature as the feminine Gaia, and reason as the masculine figure in a white lab coat who dominates her, controls her. You also see it in the narratives that feminize lower races, the ones that prescribe what categories of men may have sexual access to what categories of women, and the countless advertisements that equate feminine beauty with heterosexual sexiness. One master narrative thus confirms another, and the intertwining web of these narratives creates a plausible worldview. Think of the connections between little girls' Halloween costumes when it's a Disney princess and how sexualized those have become in recent years. So that connects little girls to the sluts that the society says that they are, even before they are old enough to be sluts. In that narrative web, some of the stories depend on other stories. Those that lie farthest out on the periphery can be given up without much damage to the overall structure, but the closer the story is to the center, the more it supports. Tear out one strand there, and a great deal of the web would have to be rebuilt. But since the stories at the center of the web are taken deeply for granted, they're hard to dislodge, even when there is evidence that calls them into question. Even the oppressed themselves, who have every reason to repudiate these stories, can find it hard to do that. A master narrative that depicts their group as unworthy or morally subpar can infiltrate the consciousness of some members of the group, causing them to see themselves in the hateful light that the story sheds on them. For them, dislodging the story would require calling their own identity into question. And then, too, to the extent that group members share the dominant culture's worldview, they have an interest in keeping that narrative web intact. What's at stake is nothing less than society's and their own understanding of life and their place in the universe. Let me explain epistemic rigging. The third thing that makes damaging master narratives so hard to contest is that they're rigged to make it seem as if nothing bad is going on. Life is much more comfortable for the dominant class if its members can think of their society as just and good. That way they can approve of themselves. And it's hard to do that if subjugated or excluded classes are continually rebelling. And the use of whips and chains to keep them down just isn't very efficient. Much better to deal with resistance by stopping it before it starts. And that calls for stories that hide the coercive power circulating through society so that it's not visible unless you look closely. If you can make the justification for keeping those people in their place seem really plausible, the resulting master narrative will be so smooth and slippery that the opposition can't get hold of it. Now, one way to hide the coercion is to naturalize it, to make it seem inevitable that certain classes of people must occupy certain subordinate positions, or obvious why those people have no place in a decent society at all. An excellent way to do this is to link the identity to some feature the person was born with, such as a vagina or skin color, because then it appears as if the person's identity came into the world with her, due to some straightforward biological fact about her. The identity doesn't look as if it was socially constructed at all. No, indeed. It was God-given. And if you can't rig the master narrative by linking the identity to a trait that the group member was born with, then you might try privatizing it. Take disability, for example. Most people with disabilities weren't born with them, so that doesn't work. They acquire them later in life. The easiest thing then is to hide them away in nursing homes, or refuse to make the accommodations that allow them to participate in society. You can build your cities with plenty of curbs and steps that can't be navigated in wheelchairs. You can force people who are hearing impaired to hire their own sign language interpreters. You can require blind people to pass the same written exams as anybody else. And as for gays and lesbians, well, we know what we can do with them. You just clock what they're doing in there. And if those tactics fail, you can always normalize the identity. That's done when the norms that are supposed to regulate certain kinds of behavior, in fact, create that identity. Women's identities are normalized by imposing norms of conduct on them that deflect attention away from how they're treated. It's all too common to criticize rape victims for what they were wearing when the rape occurred, or being in a part of town that left them open to attack because they violated these norms, right? Easy, too, to blame the rape on the fact that the victim was drunk at the time or high on recreational drugs. And if dark skin is supposed to be a badge of subservience, you can be indignant at the person's insubordination, without, uppityness, without having to stop and wonder why dark-skinned people have to be subordinate. Now, if I'm right about all this, it's pretty obvious that counterstories have their work cut out for them. The master narratives that they go after are so interconnected, so deeply rooted in our psyches, and so smooth and slippery that the counterstory mostly just bounces off and rolls away harmlessly. And if it can't get inside the narrative to repair the tissue that's damaging the identity, the person bearing the identity remains unable to move about freely within her society. But let's suppose that the counterstory manages to engage with the master narrative rather than being deflected. At that point, the counterstory still faces a huge obstacle, namely the master narrative's ability to assimilate opposition like the Borg. In what's left of this talk, I'm going to describe 6 ways these narratives absorb opposition, thereby retaining their power and continuing to inflict damage. Here's the first way. You make the language pretty. Counterstories protesting violence against members of a subgroup can be tweaked so that they represent what happened in language more comfortable for the oppressor. Domestic assaults, committed far more often and more violently by men on women than the other way around, become written up in the Globe and Mail as domestic disputes, which simultaneously erases the violence and makes it appear that both parties contributed equally to a disagreement. Racial unrest is a euphemism that hides both the violent behavior of the subgroup protesting its oppression and the violence used by police or other servants of the oppressive social order to beat the subgroup back into submission. Some of my best friends are Jews, or I never think of you as black. To me, you're just human, are pretty sentiments that deny the power differential between the speaker and the subgroup, thereby making the subgroup's counterstories seem to be beside the point or inaptly targeted. And recently, I heard someone dismiss sexual harassment as, we get into these romantic entanglements, which erases not only the power hierarchy between the predator and the prey, but also diverts attention from the sense of entitlement that accompanies unwanted sexual groping. Attractive commercials that depict elderly people as retaining their white beauty and vigor well on into the golden years, where they play golf and tennis at exclusive country clubs or walk hand in hand on sunset beaches, don't just paper over the very real indignities of old age's diminishing physical and social power, but make it impossible for counterstories that destigmatize vulnerability and dependence to get any kind of a hearing at all. Here's another thing that you could do. You could play devil's advocate. That also counters a counterstory. Let's take the master narratives about lazy, shiftless poor people that arguably fuel the Harper government's cutbacks in federal spending. Suppose a group of friends are discussing these cutbacks, and, by way of a counterstory, someone points out that many people living below the poverty level actually work 2 or 3 jobs and still can't make ends meet. Now suppose, just to play devil's advocate, someone else says it's a well-known fact that poor people have babies mostly so they can receive the National Child Benefit Supplement. That assimilates the resistance by sending the conversation off into a discussion of whether people should procreate if they can't support their children, rather than engaging with the counterstory about the working poor. The devil's advocate technique can also be used to counter stories that display the sexism behind the wage gap. When this comes up, there's usually somebody, and it's not always a man, who, just for the sake of argument, says that women are paid less because they choose to take time off from work to care for their children or elderly relatives. It's a theory, for the sake of argument. Here, as in the case of cutbacks for the poor, the master narratives purporting to justify the oppression absorb the counterstory by wrapping it in a related master narrative for which the teller takes no responsibility. Often, people who play devil's advocate actually believe the arguments that they say they're making just for fun. But because they suspect that the arguments would make them sound arrogant or privileged, or make people hate them, they put them in the devil's mouth. These discussions may feel like fun to the devil's advocate, but that's because the issues under discussion don't usually directly affect them. If the devil's advocate is not one of the working poor, his motives for having children aren't questioned, ever. And if he's a man, he's not expected, in any case, to cut back on his hours at work to take care of them. But there may well be people present in these conversations who don't think devil's advocacy is fun at all. As the blogger Juliana puts it, it's physically and emotionally draining to be called upon to prove that these systems of power exist. For many of us, just struggling against them is enough. Now you want us to break them down for you? Imagine having weights tied to your feet and a gag around your mouth, and then being asked to explain why you think you are at an unfair disadvantage. Imagine watching a video where a young man promises to kill women who choose not to sleep with him, and then being forced to engage with the idea that maybe you're just a hysterical feminist seeing misogyny where there isn't any. It is incredibly painful to feel that in order for you to care about my safety, I have to win this verbal contest that you have constructed for fun. Here's another way to counter story. You can play, "What about me?" The way this game is played is to deflect the conversation back to the dominant group. Since the 1990s, a loose coalition calling themselves men's rights activists have been countering feminist counterstories by insisting that it's men who are oppressed and women who are oppressors. Men's rights groups have identified women as the source of emasculation and subjugation, claiming that they file false paternity suits and maliciously accuse innocent men of raping them. Also, some women make more money than some men do. Paul Elam, the founder of A Voice for Men, has declared publicly that if he ever sits on the jury of a rape trial, he'll vote to acquit, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the defendant is guilty. Why? Because the legal system is patently untrustworthy when it comes to the offense of rape. In this, the age of misandry, not one aspect of a rape case can be trusted. The accuser cannot be trusted. Now, Elam's way of countering the counterstory by turning the focus back on the poor mistreated men isn't particularly good because it's too crude to be plausible. But it does display how the mechanism works. Let's not talk about you when we could be talking about the much more important and put upon me. A subtler example of the "what about me" technique is one that's been described by the philosopher Uma Narayan. Since at least the publication in 1978 of Edward Said's Orientalism, many counterstories have been launched against colonialist master narratives of the barbarism and backwardness of the brown-skinned people living in the Near East and on the Indian subcontinent. But Narayan reports that in their eagerness to distance themselves from Western imperialism, Western feminists are unwilling to say anything negative about Eastern cultures. And they're equally unwilling to hear Narayan's criticisms of the Indian social order. As a result, in their conversations with her, they keep pulling the conversation back to how Western colonialism is responsible for all of India's ills. Narayan writes, what starts as a proper stress upon negative Western attitudes and interferences in the Third World grows into a focus on the big bad West, one that operates so as to virtually eclipse the Third World and its agents, institutions, and responses from view. The Third World virtually vanishes, except as a flat backdrop or frame for the bad deeds of the West. I have often felt like Alice, watching the Third World slowly disappearing from view until it has all the substantiality of the Cheshire Cat's grin. This sort of breastbeating isn't confined to groups with a colonialist history, of course. It also manifests itself in white liberal guilt, which is far more interested in how bad I feel about racism than in what it's like for you to be oppressed by it. This is, I think, our fifth way of countering a counterstory. A fourth. Okay. This is to make some people the true victims. Let's take a look at MBK, My Brother's Keeper, which you may not know anything about. It's a counterstory that was recently initiated by U.S. President Barack Obama. The name chimes nicely with MLK, Martin Luther King, who told a powerful counterstory in the 1950s and 60s that resisted racist oppression in the American Deep South. On 30 September of this year, the White House Office of the Press Secretary issued a fact sheet that states, and I'm quoting, in February, President Obama launched the My Brother's Keeper, MBK, initiative to ensure that all youth, including boys and young men of color, have opportunities to improve their life outcomes and overcome barriers to success. As part of that launch, the President also established the My Brother's Keeper Task Force to review public and private sector programs, policies, and strategies, and determine ways the federal government can better support these efforts. Notice how the true victims of racism are specifically boys and young men of color. Girls are excluded explicitly from the data used to monitor outcomes. Obama has explained why this is. His moving story of a Kenyan father he knew only for a month, and the mother who reared him to be president, attests to his sincere wish to help fatherless boys like himself, and that's all to the good. But as Kimberly Crenshaw points out, it also amounts to an abandonment of women of color, who have been among his most loyal supporters. She goes on to note that the common belief that black men are exceptionally endangered by racism is just plain false. Obama has said that boys who grow up without a father are more likely to be poor. But are they more likely than their sisters, who are growing up in the same households and neighborhoods? According to Crenshaw, black and Hispanic girls are at or near the bottom level of reading and math scores. Black girls have the highest levels of school suspension of any girls. They also face gender-specific risks. They are more likely than other girls to be victims of domestic violence and sex trafficking, more likely to be involved in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and more likely to die violently. So here we have a case of racist and sexist master narratives working together to assimilate a counterstory. They do it with a narrative that focuses so hard on what it represents as the true victims that the other equally real victims can't be seen at all. Okay. The fifth way to counter a counterstory is a specific kind of victim blaming, which says that a victim of oppression is a victim, all right, but only if she is of sterling moral character. Did he get angry when your friend told that anti-Semitic joke? Well, these Jews all tend to stick together. Was her skirt too short, or her history of sexual activity too long? Then it wasn't really rape, or at least she was asking for it. Had he ever been accused of petty theft? Then, even though he wasn't armed, you can't really blame the police for gunning him down and leaving his body on the road for 4 hours. In the United States, it's not uncommon to hear Zionists defend Israel's oppression of Palestinians by pointing out that Hamas is a terrorist organization, as if that justifies the oppression. While Hamas's activities certainly make it harder to end the violence in that part of the Middle East, and they're horrible, that's evil, the assumption that oppression is somehow legitimate because not everybody in the oppressed group is of upright moral character can just as certainly be questioned. And when all else fails, a master narrative can absorb a counterstory by changing the subject. This was brought home to me recently when the American Philosophical Association's Committee on the Status of Women, which I chair, sent a site visit team at the request of the upper administration at the University of Colorado, Boulder, to assess the climate for women within the philosophy department there. The team went, interviewed everyone in the department over a 3-day visit, and then wrote a confidential report on what it saw, with recommendations for how to improve the climate for women. Some months later, the administration made the report public, creating a firestorm in the press and on the internet. Quite a number of philosophers who were upset by the report responded not by engaging with what the site visitors found, but by starting long discussions about whether feminist philosophy was really philosophy at all, or how we should analyze the concept of evidence. There were also a number of ad hominem attacks against the 3 site visitors. The ironic upshot of it was that the site visitors, all women, experienced in full how hostile professional philosophy can be toward the 20% of women it comprises, while at the same time making it appear that they were making a large fuss, ugly fuss over nothing. The same thing can happen when somebody tries to start a discussion protesting some racist incident or pattern of incidents. Often the conversation morphs into a discussion about all the ways in which society is now post-racial, or why it's racist to bring up the topic of race in the first place. What gets lost sight of in these conversations is the racism that was the initial reason for the discussion. So by now, you are probably wondering why, if master narratives are so good at repelling or assimilating them, anybody would bother to launch a counterstory at all. If I'm right about any of this, and mind you, it's not even close to an exhaustive list of the ways to counter a counterstory, then it seems as if Bilbo the Hobbit's hope of defeating the gargantuan Smaug, who absorbs all the dwarf's treasure, is doomed from the outset. So I'm going to end this talk by explaining why that simply isn't so. To see that it isn't, we only have to look at a counterstory that's been quite effective in getting uptake by the oppressors, to the point where many members of the oppressed group are now able to exercise their agency more freely in the wider society. The group I have in mind are the people who bear the gay and lesbian identity. As recently as the 1950s, gays and lesbians lived on the fringes of U.S. society, and I believe that was also true in Canada. And in most states in the United States, there were statutes prohibiting consensual homosexual sex. With the riots in 1969 protesting the continual police harassment in Greenwich Village's Stonewall Inn, a counterstory was launched. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. 1 year after the riots, the first gay pride parades took place in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and Manhattan. And over the next 4 decades, many of the laws discriminating against gays and lesbians were gradually repealed. As of last week, same-sex marriages are legally recognized in 19 states now, and because of the Supreme Court's refusal to grant certiorari in a Wisconsin case, it appears that 11 more states will soon follow suit. Now, this doesn't at all mean that gays and lesbians aren't still oppressed, any more than it means that in Canada, even though marriage is legal here. They're still targets of abuse, bullied from pulpits and in social media, disowned by their families, murdered, or driven to suicide. Some states still refuse to recognize attacks on them as hate crimes. But the master narratives representing them as sexual perverts and child molesters no longer have the same power they did when gays were forced to live closeted because simply being gay was a crime. They enjoy much greater social acceptance than formerly, and over time we can see that identity losing some of its stigma. The reason that any counterstory has a chance of succeeding, despite whatever defenses a master narrative might set up against it, is that oppressive master narratives are false. That means there are always cracks in the story, soft spots in Smaug's underbelly that let the arrow find its mark. There are sociological data showing that gay men are considerably less likely to be pedophiles than straight men are. There are Alison Bechdel's wonderful Dykes to Watch Out For comics, which depict lesbians' lives as neither just the same as heterosexual women's lives, nor radically different from them. Some of the women in those comics are smart, some are clueless, some are decisive, others are vulnerable, handful are well-to-do, a few are grad students, and all are so interesting that you feel you know them personally. It's stories like Bechdel's that slip in under our rational beliefs and engage us at a more visceral level that are likeliest to shift the damaging master narratives that influence us. One story alone won't do it, of course, nor will even a raft of stories like the whole Dykes to Watch Out For series. But if you lose enough counterstories at that soft spot on Smaug's underbelly where that one of his scales fell off, you'll discover he's not so invincible after all. Thank you very much.
Would you like to take some questions?
Sure.
Was thinking as you're a lot of these stories. Do we need, as a student, these have both master stories and sub-stories?
I think we need master narratives because they help us navigate our social world. Most of them are benign. But it's just that our social world is full of unjust power relations, and so the master narratives are going to prop that up just as much as they do anything else in the society. But little kids learn through these master narratives. They learn how they're supposed to behave, and what other people get to do to them, and what other people are not allowed to do to them. And even as adults, sometimes a person's identity can be thrown into confusion by war or trauma or something like that. And that is useful to be able to look to a master narrative that tells you how to navigate this. We are finally getting master narratives for how to go through a divorce when there are young children involved. And we need those stories to help guide us, show us what we're supposed to do. Am I answering your question, though?
Yes, actually, you're leading me to something else, if you don't mind, the second question from me. That I was thinking of the master narrative of the military and this hypermasculinity that they're socialized to. And then when there's an injury and the perfect military body is, is damaged in the way of, a lost limb or PTSD, it's like our culture still does not know what to do with that, nor does the military.
Yeah.
And so are there ways that you get out from under a master narrative that is so embedded that you can, that some of that can be changed, so that the reaction mentally with PTSD and physically with a sense of a loss of a limb that is not hyper-masculine anymore can be changed?
Yes, people are telling counter stories there all the time. The soldiers themselves are telling them. Certainly their psychotherapists are telling those stories. People, the physicians, the nurses, all the caregivers, the families of those young men are telling those stories, and and women. So there is, I think, a kind of a collective. It's sort of like what do they call it? Chinese water torture. Drips of water that wear things down. Each counter story that somebody tells is a drip of water, and I think eventually it really already has started to move that. We don't call it shell shock anymore, and we certainly don't call it cowardice, which is what it was called in the First World War. And so I totally agree with you that the hypermasculinity that is still a part of the master narrative of how to be a good soldier is a real problem there. But I do feel that at least post-traumatic stress disorder itself is getting a different kind of reputation gradually, very gradually, that may pull against that master narrative. And again, it depends on what kind of uptake it gets. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask, in your view, is it by definition illegitimate for a person in a position of dominance to point out something wrong or false in the counter-narrative? Is there no place for that? And should the dominant therefore shut up because they've spoken too much or too long? Or because I want to how does the conversation evolve? Or so is it? I'd like to hear you on that, or where's the limit or the boundary on it?
Yeah, you don't want to be speaking as a person of privilege for oppressed people who can speak for themselves. Thank you very much. The role is to shut up and listen. But if you are hearing a counter story that is misfiring, it's well-intentioned but it's not hitting the target, you can become an ally and you can talk to the people who are oppressed and say, I think I'm seeing this about the counter story. Are you seeing it too? Is there something wrong here? And if the oppressed person wants to teach you, and there's no real reason why they should, but if they do, and if they want your help in reshaping the counter story, then maybe you've done something to help. I think it is the business of the dominant privileged people to fix oppression. It is not up to the subgroup to do it. But sometimes, because it's the dominant privileged position, you need help seeing what's wrong. So if you see something that's wrong, the first thing I would do is check to see whether the people you're trying to help agree with you that something's wrong with the counter story. Because maybe you're not right about that. Did that answer your question?
I think that sometimes a group that is dominated, is not a monolith. So there's different position or different strategy that could be adopted, and after a certain amount of time, there's a selection of we're going to go this way.
Yeah.
But this way is sometimes more masculine. So let's say
reinscribes the oppression.
It's going to be more male than the interests of male black or male Aboriginal as opposed to female black, which as within the group will be prioritized, right?
Yeah.
And so is it any? So my question was sort of like, can that be discussed?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm white. I've got all kinds of white skin privilege, And I talked back to President Obama about MBK. I don't think My Brother's Keeper is a good idea. And I checked with some black colleagues before I started speaking back, and first thing I did was read around to see what black women were saying about it, which is how I found the Kimberly Crenshaw op-ed. And then I checked with somebody else, and she said, "You bet." And so now I speak out about it. And I don't feel I'm speaking for black women, but I feel I am speaking with them. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question about when counter stories themselves get so far along that they maybe not become oppressive but constraining. So you've heard a little bit of my work about breast cancer and thriving. And then the other example of sort of queerness becoming so normal now that we're now saying we're here, we're queer, and we're not shopping, right? So this idea that we're a market. And so is there a way of keeping, like, do you have to keep renewing them so they stay counter stories?
Because they get co-opted all the time. That's the dragon that just won't die. Damn it. It's wounded, it's crawling around on the ground, but it can still do damage. And certainly the we're not shopping one needs very much to be said right now. The picture I put up there was precisely a marketing strategy. And the pink ribbons, oh my God, if I see one more pink ribbon, I'm going to throw up.
October in Canada.
It's just insane, and I hate that story. All it does is make people feel good about themselves, but it does nothing for breast cancer. Aware, we got to be. And I think in the United States, October is Little People of America Awareness Month, and I have some friends who are dwarfs who are going, "What on earth is this? What are they supposed to be aware of?" So and there's just no end of the ways in which counter stories could either be ill-formed in the first place, so they're not really equipped to do the job, or they get co-opted and they change, because stories are always changing, and then they become ill-equipped to do the job. Nicely pointed out there.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, since technology is moving so quickly and there are things like social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, do you think that that's made the progression of counter stories happen more quickly or bring things to the forefront more quickly?
That is a great question, and it would take a sociologist to answer it. I don't have data for that, but my guess would be it must do. I think it must do. I mean, just think of Facebook memes and how fast they circulate. And a lot of those are counter stories of some kind or another. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. My question is, what are the conditions that determine uptake?
Oh, I have been thinking hard about that ever since I started developing this concept. And there are many material conditions that will determine uptake. Things like capitalism. In the 1950s in the United States, after the Second World War is over, women were sent back out of the factories because they were taking men's jobs away from them. And these men had gone overseas to risk their lives for American freedom. And so they get to have their jobs back. But then women started pushing back against that a little bit. And it turned out that in a capitalist economy, you need to have more money available than one paycheck would bring in, especially since there was this housing boom and lots more people needed to buy places to live. And so women got into the workforce. And then the little counter story trotted after it, and that became the women's liberation movement. Okay, this is my rough and dirty story of how all this happened. But in that case, the material conditions of the changes after the war was over had a great deal to do with women's economic freedom, at any rate. But then there's all the rest of those stories, the ones about, we've never had a divorce in our family. So even if women had the economic freedom to leave an abusive marriage, they would be shamed if they did it, and so on. So, there are various parts of it that never quite catch up with the other parts. So market, institutional change. Sometimes a counterstory will start an institution into changing. That's what happened when women were admitted to universities. And then universities fairly quickly figured out that you could relegate women to certain sorts of professions. They could become teachers, so you have a college of education that's for them mostly, and then maybe in social work too, you have a lot of women, put them there. But you still don't really want to have women in engineering or in, the high-paid jobs. So you can figure out how to absorb, how to change the conditions back so that the master narratives will hold sway again. It's a very dynamic thing, and that's one of the reasons why master narratives are so hard to get rid of. But it's certainly not all just in what we understand about who we are. It's political, it's institutions, it's social practices, all of that's involved.
Follow-up.
Yeah.
So do you talk about tipping points or thresholds so that there's an accumulation of sort of frustrated counterstories to the point where all of a sudden there's some sort of cultural shift that is that part of your work?
If I were a sociologist, I'd study that, but I don't know that I recognize tipping points when I see them. I know about something about mob tipping points, what will turn a crowd of protesters suddenly into a mob. But as far as tipping points for getting a counterstory uptake, I think the only ones that I know of that have worked successfully at the social level, where we're talking about social groups, usually don't work like that. It's very slow increments, usually. With personal counterstories, oh yeah, and the tipping point is often anger. I'm not going to take it anymore. Yeah.
I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the original people where we are, the land that's unceded, Maliseet, the Waterstone
Yes.
land.
Yes.
And I'd like to follow up on terms of that central narrative, that master narrative, and that web, and the economic impact.
Yes.
That holds that together, and how that influences every strand that leads out, or any of these other narratives that are all part of that big web, and how you see that web being somehow affected, influenced, so that it can be accepting of all these other narratives rather than just seen as confrontational.
Yeah, confrontational, or even better, let's just erase them. Let's just not think about First Nations people. Let's just forget about the history we have here. I think that First Nations people, if they're anything like the story of Native Americans in the United States, and I think there are some similarities, it's their stories and their tribal practices that keep them holding on to any kind of an identity at all. And those are pretty fragile, I think, and easily commercialized. And so trying to carve out space in the wider society can sometimes be helped with things like the Canadian government maybe acknowledging, asking for forgiveness for the, residential schools and things like that. But I am not very hopeful that that identity can be preserved if there isn't more integration of that way of life into what other people who don't live that way of life respect, honor, and support. Mostly it just becomes sort of assimilation. I mean, you can be over here on the fringes, but you got to act like the rest of us. And that's no use at all. That just doesn't help anything. That is a form of genocide, I think. So that's a very tricky question. I have never yet seen a government. I've paid attention to this phenomenon in Canada, in the United States, and in New Zealand. And in none of those places have I seen anything remotely like adequate government support of the indigenous people's way of life. So I'm not holding my breath. And I hate to be so pessimistic, but that one really worries me. Somebody tell a joke, quick. Yes.
This is not a joke. We have an actor narrative being played out right now in that our peaceful country is under terrorist attack.
Yeah, oh yes.
That's a really...
Yeah, you've been assimilated by the United States paranoia. God. Yeah, and we've moved it to Ebola, which kind of you all have too a little bit. But the big terrorist attack was what happened in Parliament last week in Ottawa, I know. And, this was one very vicious, deranged person. And it was stopped immediately by a very brave sergeant-at-arms. And I don't see how in any way that qualifies as a terrorist attack. But if you call it that, then you can have people living in fear. And as Goebbels and Goering figured out years ago, that's a great way to keep a people subdued so that they'll do what you want them to.
Pass legislation.
Yeah.
Wait for the legislation, it's coming.
Yep. Yeah.
Just one more question. In Canada, we have had very few women in leadership.
You shock me.
And apparently 50 years ago it was, or 25 years ago maybe, it was 7%. And the stats are exactly the same now, 7% women in parliament. In Canada over the last few years, we've had 5 women as premiers of provinces. And at one time we had one prime minister who was female. But none of them lasted any more than a year or 2 years.
Any First Nations leadership at that level? I didn't expect it. Yeah.
So it's a story that's, as you said, to break into and to stay there in terms of a new narrative is very difficult to do.
Yeah, first to bust open the oppression and then to sustain the change. Those are both very difficult to do. Because again, I think because there are so many mini forces, it's some of it is the narratives that are so interwoven with other narratives, and that connective tissue is really strong, and other pieces of it are just little aggressions that people mount against each other every day that contribute to that. Yeah.
Just wanted to know, do you think Hillary has a shot in 2016?
She might, because she's acting more and more like a man all the time. Could be. Yeah.
I'd just like to follow up a little bit on that acknowledgement about the land and that central narrative. The master narrative. I saw that web as the central narrative seems to be about capitalism.
Yes.
And money.
Yes. Which is why the casinos are that's supposed to be the way of life now for First Nations people.
The land and our relationship to the land.
Wouldn't that be nice?
In terms of the teachings, the traditional teachings, and that relationship being around that mother that takes care of all of this. Is that, like, do we have to change, can we change that central narrative?
I don't know. I don't know, because capitalism is such a powerful force in Canada and the United States and Europe and, you know, other industrialized nations. And to focus on the land requires either a hunter-gatherer sort of society or an agricultural society, and we have neither. And so that makes it very easy for power to erase that, or what it actually does is to Monsanto it, you know? And then you factory farm it all, and you genetically alter the crops and stuff. So,
yeah. Just thinking, in the interest of time, if we could take one last question with Nate.
Oh, sure.
It's a joke.
Yes, but I'm not good at making jokes. I just had kind of a bit of a vague question about animals.
yes.
And about, you didn't use any examples
No.
about having to do with master narratives about human kind of domination of animals and human-animal boundaries.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering if there's a reason for that, or if there might be, like, how animals could kind of fit in your...
Yeah, if it's just fine. I didn't prioritize that because I was talking about social group oppression, and animals aren't really, you know, defined as a social group, but there have been great counter stories told about animal oppression since, the first one I know of is David Hume, who talked about the enslavement of cows. And then Peter Singer's work in the 1970s, animal liberation and so on. And now there are all kinds of people who are pushing back against the thought that animals are simply there for our use and abuse. And I think that's done a lot of good. But the trouble there, one piece of the trouble, why those stories aren't getting more uptake. They're even getting economic uptake because people who do organic farming and stuff like that are finding that this is a fine way to make a living. But there isn't, at least in the United States, there isn't yet the government forbidding certain sorts of treatment of animals, certain factory farming of animals, the caged hens and the things they do to beef and to, you know, pigs. So I think until you get something with teeth behind it, and that may just take that the ideology has to shift a little more so that the social policy will follow. Sometimes it goes that way. And sometimes it goes the other way. With integration in the United States, you had to first have the Civil Rights Act. And once that was passed, then after about a couple of decades, the most virulent white supremacist racists in the South started rethinking how they were supposed to treat black people. And so there the stories changed after the laws were passed. It can go either way. Thank you very much. You were very kind to come out on a cold night in the middle of the week when you have better things to do, and I very much appreciate it.